All right. Well, welcome everyone to our After the Pause series
Yep.
podcast on YouTube. What are we calling this again?
Whatever it is. We are doing a
Okay.
thing. And thank you for being here.
Right. That. If this is your first time tuning in, one, we would encourage you to check out the other content on this channel because this is the place we've been talking through all things A Place Called Braverly.
Woo.
And tonight we are actually diving into the final chapter, which doesn't mean it's the end of our time together, but it's the final chapter of the book, chapter 8, all about courageous communion. I'm super excited for this one because I feel like this is one of those chapters that has thrown the most people off,
Yeah.
maybe. Right? Of just why did you end the book with that? So, Kate, as it's your chapter, you're going to take us in. Why did we close the book with a chapter on courageous community?
Yeah. It's so true. I remember one of our good friends, she read the book before it was published just to help us, just a rough draft, having other people look at it. And she had such good things to say about it, and not to toot her own horns, she loved it. But she really loved the book, and but she was like, my one thing is why did you end it the way you did? I don't understand why you finished with a chapter on community. And that chapter really came, yeah, I would say, maybe you would say the same thing, Christy, but that chapter in my mind was one that we had talked about from the very beginning. Like, something needs to be in this book about community, and not because it's a buzzword, not because it's build community, it's so good, there's just something about community and communion that we really wanted to talk about when it came to courage. And so we started the book with kind of a random thing of resting in the Father, be courageous, now rest. Like, what? And we're ending it with communion. Because I do think it's so important. I think in communion, with the Father and with each other, we borrow and we share courage. We probably don't share courage with the Lord, but we certainly find our true sense of courage in Him. And then in relationship with others, like we've talked about this before, where there's been so many moments in my life where I just can't find the courage to take that next step that the Lord is asking me to do, or maybe I'm just struggling in general with fear. And I see, Christy, I see the life that you live, and I see the steps that you take, and I see the courage that you have, and I borrow that courage from you. And it goes both ways, right? I'm just gonna you'd probably be like, yeah, same, but no, don't have to say that. It
Absolutely.
goes both ways. It goes both ways in relationship. And I think that communion is just so important. And so that's why we included it in the book. And we also included it because at the end of the day, we just weren't meant to do this life alone. We were meant to do it with each other. Building communion is so hard. Building community is so hard, especially as an adult. What is the deal with trying to build community with others? There's so many walls that we have, and so many hesitancies that we have, but that community is so important. And so that's why we included a chapter, and that communion with each other. It requires deep courage. Not only do we get courage and we share courage with each other, but it also requires courage to step into communion, and build true community with others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that the book ends the way that it does, and not just biased because we're the ones who wrote it, but I mean it's true. Like, to us, I feel like it makes sense to end the book in this way because we set off with a very specific purpose anyway of this was meant to be a tool in the
Yeah.
first place, and a tool that others could use in community. And so in our minds that makes sense, right? Like a book that's calling women specifically to be courageous and to step into these places, but do that together. But in today's world, maybe it doesn't make as much sense
Yeah.
because of the state of today's world, right? Like, we're very independent people. We can be very disconnected people, and maybe more so in these past couple years than ever before. So I think in those ways, maybe it surprises people, but that's why I love that we're talking about it tonight. I love that we're going to dive into just what's the intent behind this chapter. And yeah, so take us in a little bit further.
Yeah.
Why this chapter? What all is in it? What do you want to unpack with us tonight?
Yeah, totally. It's so good and so true. Our world is so disconnected, and we're so divided, but also so connected. and
Yeah.
so together. Like, it's just such a weird dynamic. I actually wrote this chapter at the the start of 2020 because I
Mhm.
remember like starting to write this chapter and then like took a minute to get it right. Not that it's perfect, but it took a minute. And by the time COVID hit, I was really like finding my groove with the chapter. And then I was like, I'm supposed to write a chapter on communion. And like, I've never seen our world so divided as COVID. So, not that we're getting into that tonight, but just like a little backstory of where this, what was happening while we were writing this chapter. That's what was happening. So, that was a really interesting dynamic. But I think this idea of communion, if you've been in the church long, you know what communion is. It's the act of, breaking bread and drinking wine, and we're drinking grape juice because we don't drink alcohol in the church. Just kidding. Let's not get into that. Anyways, but it's the act of the Last Supper, and this idea of communion and this chapter came from that story. That communion is more than just that act. Like, and when we talk about it in this chapter, it's more than just the act of breaking bread and drinking wine and remembering just Jesus's sacrifice for us. That is certainly part of it. But when we talk about communion, it's this intimacy, it's this deep knowing of each other and of the Lord. It's this sacred act that we share together. And in the book we talk about, there's two different kinds of community or communion that we dive into. And the first is communion with the Father, communion with the Lord. Right, in Jesus's life, we see him go away and pray and be with the Lord. We see just his daily acts being led by the Lord, having that deep, rich communion with the Father. And that's something that we need in our life too. I mean, if Jesus needed it, like, come on, we need it. And then we see the other part of communion is with each other. In Jesus, he had the 12 disciples, and he had many others. But we see him have that relationship with the Father, and then with those 12 disciples, and then with others as well. And that relationship with the 12 was very intimate. I mean, he let them see like almost every part of his life. And he brought, like, they literally followed him. So they were with him constantly. And I'm not saying that we need to do that in our life, but that kind of intimate connection with each other, that kind of knowing of each other, like, that is something that's really beautiful that I think that we should strive for. And so in this chapter, we talk about, those moments with the disciples where he's washing their feet, where it says that in different translations, it translates it differently, but there's one translation that says he showed them the full extent of his love. And that starts with washing their feet. And it certainly ended with him dying on the cross for them. But it started with this sacrificial, very humble, getting on the ground and washing dirty feet, and something that was just not that he shouldn't have done, but he did because of that was the full extent of his love. And then later in that story, you see him going off and praying, like, with such fervor to the Father, and with such angst and such emotion, because there's so much vulnerability that he has with the Father in that moment. And so we dive into that story a lot, in the book, but I think that what I really want to focus in on, tonight, I think there's a couple of different parts of communion that are really important. We talk about communion love in the chapter. We talk about communion vulnerability in the chapter, and then we talk about communion persistence, even through pain. And as I was thinking about just this series and what we should dive into, that communion persistence, I think, is such a an important thing for us to talk about, especially in our world today. Um, there's just We're so quick to cut people off and out. We're super quick to run away from anything that causes pain or discomfort. I am super guilty of that in my life. Like, it's really easy to choose like the easiest path of least resistance. But what we see in Jesus is somebody that persists even when it's painful. He is certainly vulnerable. He is certainly um, inclusive and loves people. He doesn't exclude others. Like, he loved Judas until the very end, right? Like, that's that's wild. But what I see too that Jesus does that I think we need to model in our life is this idea of persisting with others even when it's painful. And that's so hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, but so good. There's so much that you just like said that I hope people just like sit with that for a second, go back, rewatch that part, like that simple word that's so difficult to persist
Mhm.
with others. And I agree. I think in today's world we don't do that really well. I'm guilty of it as well. And we get like in our little bubbles of our people, right? And if we look around, like our people look a lot like us. And I think for me personally, like I've really been challenged over these years to pop that, right? Like
Mhm.
to invite people in that I wouldn't normally have rubbed shoulders with, you
Yeah.
know? And that sounds so terrible to say out loud, but like it's the reality of like where we get ourselves kind of wedged into sometimes. And so I think that there's something so beautiful in that. And I love you made mention, and this is going to be a side tangent, and I'm sorry, but you made
I love
mention
it.
of Judas, right?
Mm.
And like just Jesus knew who Judas was. This one's on my brain because I was also rewatching The Chosen today. So shout
Mm.
out Dallas Jenkins and The Chosen.
Eh.
But it was the Judas episode, like where we're first introduced to him.
Mm.
It's just briefly. But I was just thinking about that story of Jesus called Judas too. He
Yeah.
invited him in and he knew very well like who Judas was, who he was going to be.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus made space for him. And we're not saying that tonight like invite all these toxic people into your
Yes.
circle. Don't hear that.
Yeah.
But making space for people and persisting in relationships because you believe in just who the father created those people to be. So I'll end my tangent and let you keep going, but all that to say
Yeah.
I just think yes, persistence in relationships, in communion, both with the father and with each other, so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that was the tension that I ran into as I wrote this chapter and as we edited it together. Um, there is such a tension in communion, especially with each other, where
Mhm.
we are not advocating for staying in abusive relationships or staying in relationships that are just toxic, like you talked about. Like there's such a tension in relationships and in boundaries with others because I think that boundaries with others are good. I think that they help. I don't know. They just help make us healthier and help the other person as well sometimes. But then there's other times where we maybe overcompensate in boundaries, or maybe there's times that we like just like you know what you like fill me with some like negative vibes, so I'm gonna like kind of cut you off and like sometimes I think that's not okay.
Mhm.
But there's such a tension. And so that's why we need communion with the Father too. Like we need both because we are like if we are truly following Jesus, if we truly call ourselves Christians, we are led by the Holy Spirit. We are trying to pursue the life that Jesus lived and the example that we see that he gave us. And we are trying to just follow him. And so if we have that leading, if we have that in our life, like that tension, it doesn't become simple, but it becomes easier because we're being led by him. So that is why we need both. And I need that in my life. Like we all need it. We need him to show us because there's going to be moments like in my life and I talk about this in the book like I had a friend that I have a friend that we've been friends since like first grade. I mean, like we have been friends for a long time and I am no longer in first grade. We're not going to say ages on this thing, but I'm older than I look. And so I've been friends with this woman for so long and for the longest time like our paths were like this and we like our beliefs were super similar like we had things like almost everything in common and the things that we didn't have in common were really beautiful because we challenged each other and grew each other in really really rich ways in my opinion and and as we grew up though as often happens when you step out of your parents house and you're trying to figure out your own way our differences became more and more and more and more distinct from each other um and and just more like to the point of like believing just very different things about what the Bible says about things, about how we're supposed to live our life, like what is sin and what's not. And that's when it gets really tricky, right? In communion is when it's like, well, not just when it's like, my preference is that we eat out tonight, but your preference is, like that kind of thing. Like it's not preferences. It's like, this is what I believe is core to our faith that we say we have in common. And I think that a lot of us have run into that, especially in the last few years, where we're running into people that we have known for so long and have shared such rich histories with. And then not all of a sudden, but it feels like all of a sudden we are split on really key issues or things that feel really important to us. And there's a moment that we have to ask ourselves, like, are we going to persist with this person? And what I see in Jesus's life is that he persisted with people. Maybe not with everyone, like maybe there were truly boundaries that he set in relationship. Like he didn't have everyone in his inner circle. Not everyone got to share that intimacy. Like there was 12 and there's so many other people, crowds followed him, but there were 12 that got to see that inner life, that inner circle of Jesus and get to follow him in that really intimate way. And so certainly there was boundaries that were set. But even if you look at Jesus's relationship with Peter, my main man, Peter, who just like, he just always messed up, but he was so I don't know, his intention, his motivation. I'm like, he wants to follow Jesus. And I'm sure that Jesus also was like, he really wants to follow me. He's just really messing it up sometimes. But like even Peter and his relationship with the Lord, where he, he denied knowing him 3 times and he like cut off a dude's ear. Like he was just not always the most stand-up person, but at the end, before Jesus went up into heaven, like, and he met the disciples on the beach, like, he's like, Peter, do you love me? Like, lead my people, lead my sheep. Like, I believe in you. I want to persist with you in community, in communion. I think that we see Jesus persisting with others. And so for me, like when I not past tense, but literally like every week when I experience this disconnect with one of my dearest friends, like I have to choose persistence because I love her so dearly. And because I know that like who like Jesus persisted with so many people and people that did far worse than like our disagreement, people that like crucified him, like he persisted, people that denied knowing him, like he persisted with them. And I think that we need the same thing in our lives. Like we're so quick to cut people off or ideas off. And some of that's not bad, right? We just talked about the tension. But there is certainly a place for persistence with each other, even in the pain, even in like the discomfort. It has not always been easy, to be honest, like to persist it with my friend. And I think she'd say the same for me. So like that's why I'm like, I think you could talk about this because I'm pretty sure she'd say the exact same thing. Where she's probably like, my gosh, that Kate. It's not easy to persist with each other. But I think that we can experience something so rich when we persist even in the pain, when we persist even in those disagreements or whatever it looks like, because we see that Jesus did the same thing. And even like, I mean, if you think about like how the Father loves us still today, he's persisting a whole lot with us, with people that are really messed up, that make mistakes all the time, that sin. Like he constantly forgives us, he constantly loves us, and he constantly stays in that connection with us. And that's what we're called to do as well. And that's so hard, but so important.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like it takes such a vulnerability from us, like to
Mhm.
persist in that way, right? Like, because it's a laying down of yourself.
Yeah.
And it's a laying down of ourselves in both relationships, right? Like, 'cause this is a both and. It's not like a like persist with people here or persist with the Father. Like it's a both and both of those take such vulnerability with the Father in the sense of like taking the time, like laying ourselves down before him and saying, whatever you want from me, like I'm in, like that's a vulnerable position to be in, but
Mhm.
it's this beautiful persistence of like, I want to be in relationship with you, like I want to be in communion with you. And the same is true for the people in our lives, the people in
Yeah.
our circle. Like there's such a vulnerability when it comes to communion and allowing ourselves to like open up and be open to who other people are and seeing the Father in and through them. And so I don't know, there's so many words that are buzzwords and I'm throwing all of them out and we're
I
throwing all of them
know.
out together tonight, and it's fine because we can still talk about them. And I don't think they need to be these hot topics that we make them
Mhm.
in the way that we talk about them all the
Yeah.
time. I think that we're missing the beauty in those words because of what they've become.
Yeah.
um, but persistence, vulnerability, both are necessary when it comes to community, when it comes to communion with with the Father and with others. um, yeah, and we just want to help people do it well. We want to do it
Yeah.
well. We all
Oh
want
my
to
gosh,
learn
yeah.
from one another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think too, as you were just sharing, one of the things that I thought about is and I don't know if we really dive into it in the chapter, but I think it's really true and really important. Um, like as we build communion with one another, it is so important to persist with each other, even when there's differences, because like each one of us shows each other, like to each other, we show just more sides of who God is. Um, like your differences and my differences, like sometimes it is like there's such a fine line, right? Because there's sometimes where it's like, okay, but like that's not actually biblical. You know what I mean? Like there's those differences, or it's like, okay. But I think that more times than not, like our differences, they show us another side of who God is. Like if we truly believe that each of us was made in the image of God, like that means that each of us is in the image of God and is showing each other like another side of his face. And I think
Mhm.
that that's so beautiful and another reason to just continue to persist with one another, to continue to grow with one another. Because also, like, we show each other a different side of the Father, but we also show each other almost like another side of courage, like what
Mhm.
courage looks like in my life. It looks different than your life, and it looks different than my husband's life and the people that I interact with in Chicago. Sometimes our courage looks very different, but our courage is courage nonetheless, and it's so incredible to borrow that courage from one another. Like I work with refugees and immigrants here in the city, and the courage that I see in their lives is like,
Mhm.
oh, that's courageous. Like the things that they have overcome and the ways that their courage has made them who they are today. I I want that courage, and I not that I want some of their story because it can be really intense, but their courage is something that I haven't had to experience in my life or haven't seen a lot, but it's beautiful, and I want to apply that to my life. And so if we have people in our lives that are different from us, if we persist with them, we also get to see another side of courage and another example of what courage looks like in their life. And then we can also borrow some of that when we need it, or just in our everyday lives, even if we don't feel like we need it. And so I think that's also why like persisting with one another is so, so important, from the idea of courage and how we live with courage, how we dream with courage, and how we inspire courage in others. We need that persistence. And I think that the persisting, that being vulnerable with others and with truly showing each other the full extent of our love for them, that forges such deep connection and deep communion with each other that won't be easily torn down when we hit bumps, because we will hit bumps and things will get rocky. But it won't be as easily torn down if we do those things and if we stay connected with the Father. And it's such a lifelong journey. I know that some people like hate that, it feels like so cliche, like I'm on a journey, but we are, and we're just trying to take this step by step with the Lord. And we're gonna learn in every season. Every season is gonna be different, but I think that that is so important to continue to build those community with others, um, with just that love and vulnerability and certainly persistence.
Yeah, absolutely. And hence the chapter title, Courageous Communion, right?
Yes.
It is all about courage is what it boils down to. Like, it's courageous to persist with people. It's courageous to step into community with people, to be vulnerable. It's courageous to do all of those things. And I love what you said. And we have talked about it before, that we get to share and borrow courage from one another. And that, more than anything, is why we need each other. It's why
Yeah.
we need the Father. He's the source of our courage in the first place. He's the one who calls us courageous. We've talked about those things.
Yeah.
And so in relationship with him, we can find courage, but in relationship with others, we can also share and borrow courage.
Yeah.
Um, it's just a beautiful place, a hard place
Yeah.
to live, a hard place to find. And I agree, maybe even harder to find in those adult years. Um, but so necessary. It never stops being the thing that we need to find, is relationship with the Father and relationship with others.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so good. I
So
mean, we could
good.
keep going and talk a lot more tangents about communion, how to build it well. What does this look
Oh,
like? Where do we go from here? All of the things.
yep.
Um, there's plenty of more of that that gets unpacked. If I can plug the book again, there's plenty more of that that gets unpacked within the pages of this book. Um, if you haven't gotten a copy, friends, definitely do it. You can order a copy off of our website, a place called braverly.com, or anywhere that books are sold. And if you're into free things, we say this all the time, but if you can get the free ebook version of it, and who doesn't want free things?
Oh, I love free
You can tell
things.
your friends about it. You can share it with your friends. That's what it's for. We want to see people
Mhm.
take this journey together. So don't miss your opportunity to dive in, get the book for yourselves. Don't just take our word for it. And like we said at the beginning, if this is your first time tuning in, if you haven't had any idea what these talks are about, go back and watch past ones. We've taken time to unpack each chapter over the course of these weeks. And also in the mix of that, have interviewed some really incredible people
Yeah.
to just chat about courage, which we have another interview coming up next week. I have to look at her name so I don't say it wrong, right? I know Cameron, but Daru, Cameron, if you're watching this, look, you got a
Sorry.
difficult last name and it's fine.
We've
And we
actually
love
even
you for
shortened it. So
it. Good. It's like a hyphenated name, and that's the shortened version. Oh gosh, but we're so excited to talk with her. If she's not a name that's familiar to you, that's okay. We actually just met her a couple weeks ago
yeah.
anyway. But that's the cool part about diving into stuff like this, is we've gotten connected to some really amazing people. So we're excited to chat with her about courage. We're excited to just hear more from you. Feel free at any time, friends, to drop us comments. Let us know, like, if you've got someone that you think you should chat with them about their courageous journey. My
Yeah.
goodness, comment that. We would love to talk with more people.
Yes.
Yeah, check out the book, subscribe to the channel. There's a button somewhere. I don't
Somewhere
know where it
here
is,
on the
but
screen.
you can find it. And yeah, we'll be back again
Yep.
next week with Cameron.
Yep. And happy Thanksgiving, everyone. You're in Thailand, so it's a little different there. But here it's
Yeah.
Thanksgiving week. So happy
Happy
Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thanksgiving. Sweet. All right. We will see you guys next time on After the Pause.